are from Code.gov, and today we're going to talk about shaping the contributor experience. I'm Sara Cope, the lead engineer on Code.gov.
And I'm Courtney. I was a Civic Digital Fellow on the Code.gov team this summer.
So Code.gov was created out of the federal source code policy, which was actually released in August of 2016. Now, in that policy, it said that federal agencies had to open source at least 20% of their code. And so Code.gov was created in order to house and inventory all that code that was being open sourced. And the point of this was to not only have a place to share it, but create a place where folks can come and find that code and reuse it and contribute to it, with the ultimate goal of reducing duplicative efforts and saving money across the US. So in November of that same year, in 2016, our former White House leader, Alvin Salehi, announced Code.gov right here at GitHub Universe. So I'm super excited to be back with you today and celebrating Code.gov's 3rd birthday and talking with you about some of the things that we've been up to. Now, when Code.gov launched, it did so with less than 50 repositories of federal open source code. And today we have more than 6,000, which is incredible and exciting. I actually joined the Code.gov team about a year ago at the end of summer of 2018. And here we are. This is part of our team that we had at a hackathon event for George Washington University students. We actually did several hackathons last year, and we saw some common themes coming out from those events. We would always go through our project repositories and provide those to people, so if they wanted to contribute to the Code.gov platform, they were able to. We'd introduce it to them, we'd set up some issues and make sure there were beginner-friendly issues and ask folks to contribute. But we did notice some problems there. So some of the problems that we had was in the Code.gov platform, we actually had a lot of repos. There were more than 20 available, not only for the platform itself, but some of the tools we used and some of the other products and documentation that we created. So there was a lot going on in that ecosystem. And as a result, folks who wanted to contribute to the Code.gov platform weren't really sure where to begin. There was too much. If they did find a repo where they decided to contribute, they didn't always get it up and running, depending on what operating system they were using on their machine. If they were able to get the platform up and running locally, they sometimes missed out on a few things that weren't clear. So if they didn't request their own API key, or they didn't request the design system, you still weren't getting the full platform experience. We also noticed when people did enter issues or pull requests, they weren't always doing that on the correct repository, because again, it wasn't really clear with everything that we had going on. Now, at that same time last year, we were working on replatforming the site from Angular to React. And that was a big lift. So we knew we had these contributor experience problems, but we didn't really have time to focus in on them at that time. And then the following month, in December of last year, we were actually forced to stop working on the platform. This lasted for 5 weeks, and it ended up being 10% of our work for the year. When a government shutdown happens, federal employees are not allowed to work, and it's really gray whether that continues to open source repos or not. It's actually illegal for us to continue working in a volunteer state. So we didn't make any progress on the platform. And when I did return to work, I did so on a smaller team. The two other engineers who were on the Code.gov team had moved on during the government shutdown. So I went from being on an engineering team to just being the engineering team. And while I was super excited to be back to work at the end of the government shutdown, to say I was absolutely panicked and terrified would be a super understatement. This is literally me. At one point, I was also working on 3 other projects while working on the Code.gov platform. I wasn't on the project full time. And I was actually new to React. So I spent a lot of the government shutdown just trying to figure out React myself. And so to come back and be the only person was horrific. So I knew right off the bat that I had to take a step back and figure out what I needed to do to keep it all together. I really had to focus on the small things and ask myself every day, what can I do today to create a better tomorrow for myself? And a lot of times that just meant reading some more documentation, adding another test, automating some small task that will make a big difference in the long run. I also knew I needed to keep advocating for more team members. Within the federal government, it can be a super hard and slow process to add members to the team. So I kept my voice up and be sure to ask for more team members. I also asked for help, not only from within our team, but from the other engineers within our organization. We're lucky enough to have a really great organization within TTS of 18F and innovation teams, so I was able to tap into those folks and ask for help. And in the end, I just had to remember to give myself grace. If the platform burned down, it'll be fine, because we're open source, and we use version control, and everything's on GitHub, so I knew if I published anything that was bad, we could just always roll it back, and that helped give me confidence. So these are some of the reasons why we wanted to focus on contributor experience so that I had more support and we could move forward with the platform. And I'm also super thankful that Code.gov is an open source project that anyone can contribute to. Because of this, the 2 staff that left were able to continue to chat with us and add pull requests and comment on issues in their free time. This allowed us to create a more easy transition between team members. And because we have an open community in Slack, they were also able to continue to connect with the community and keep the conversation going. So what do we do? Right away, we put a freeze on new feature development. Because new features are great, but if you don't feel confident and trust your platform, you don't want to keep moving forward. At the same time, we also knew that we had to keep doing our security updates, so we are addressing any vulnerabilities as they came along. Tests became a much higher priority, adding more tests to more platforms everywhere, and adding those to continuous integration to automate them. And then we also kicked off our contributor experience user research.
So as Sara mentioned, the team decided to do some user research to identify ways that we could make our platform more contributor-friendly. And so the team's UX analyst, Chrissy Kimura, did some amazing interviews and analysis of other open source projects to try and figure out what were some of the best tips and practices that we could follow with our own repos. We wanted to do this both to improve our own repos and to serve as a model to the other 6,000 repos that are on Code.gov that other agencies maintain and that are looking for open source contributors. And we also looked at things like GitHub's best practices and other, like I said, other open source repos to see how we could make our repos the best they could be. So the team ended up doing 14 total interviews with a range of participants. This included both people that had previously contributed to Code.gov and also people who might want to contribute in the future. We went through the process of creating email templates and consent forms, interview guides, and research plans that we could use to get really good insights from these interviews. And we ended up recording them, taking really copious notes, and condensing our findings into lessons learned, both for how we could do user research better in the future and for how we could improve the contributor experience for the Code.gov platform. These are some of the tools that the team used, which we had at our disposal, luckily, to keep notes, do hangouts and video chats, and advertise our user research to get participants. Some of the things that the team learned that are going to be used going forward with future research are, we know that sometimes people don't have the ability to use Google Hangouts or Meet for whatever reason, so we always have a backup ready, so that's not a last-minute barrier to doing some research. It's important to set up some folders and templates and documents beforehand so that it's easy to keep everything organized as we go through the process. And finally, it's important to book at least 50 minutes with user research participants. Anything less just doesn't get you really valuable insights. And in terms of how we could improve the contributor experience, there are 4 major barriers that we identified that discourage people from contributing to our projects or to open source projects in general that we wanted to work on addressing. So one of them was, if people found a project that hadn't been contributed to or changed in a long time, they really weren't interested in contributing. They weren't sure if their contribution was going to be accepted, if it was going to be helpful at all, and so that definitely discouraged them from participating. We knew we had some Code.gov repos that were old or archived that we need to make sure were clear that they weren't active projects that we needed help with. The second thing is we really needed to focus on good documentation. It's a really important but frequently overlooked part of having a high-quality open source project that's easy to contribute to. And with our project specifically, with so many different repos that contribute to one platform, having clear documentation about how they all connect is really important. We also found that people really valued a code of conduct, not just one that was there, but one that was enforced. So we thought a little bit about how to address that concern. And finally, people were much more likely to contribute to a project when there were other participants contributing. They felt like that was a signal that the project was welcoming to outside contributors and that their contributions would be seen, valued, merged, and actually put into production if possible.
So thinking about those barriers to contribution, we decided to focus in on 4 major areas to tackle. And I'm going to go through some of those today, but we actually ended up with a whole spreadsheet of items. So if anyone wants that later, we can connect and I can share it. The first area that we focused in on was documentation. We saw a huge issue with documentation on our project. Right off the bat, we decided to set a minimum level of documents that we were going to create and include on each repo. That way, folks who were coming recognized immediately that this is a Code.gov repo. They knew where to get the documents they were looking for, and it established some consistency. We then took those same starter documents and created a repo template in GitHub so that for any future repos that we create, we're getting that same set of documents. We also took the time to redo all of our tags across all of our repos. So if you went to one of our repos, it would have different tags labels than one of the other repos, which again was super confusing to people, and it didn't really help us stay organized. So we used an automated tool to create a standard JSON file of tags and upload those across of our repos. We also spent a lot of time incrementally just making updates to the documentation and re-looking at that with users so that it made more sense how all the pieces of the platform work together and where you needed to go to do what. We also took a look at transparency. So we added some badges for testing and continuous integration to our platforms, things like CircleCI and Jest. One of the things that was surprising to us in our research is people really like those badges. We also worked on our release notes and making those more detailed and using those more often and publishing those not only on GitHub, but to our listserv and to our Slack so that people are more easily able to see our updates in different places. We also have a product roadmap published to Code.gov. So if you go to the footer of our site, you can click on our roadmap and see what we're up to. In addition to that, we've been putting more of an effort into publishing blog posts about the work that we're doing, including this work on user research. We've also taken a look at community engagement. So we've started explicitly thanking our contributors in release notes. We also have published our mission and vision to the homepage of our site to help show people what we're doing and why the work we're doing is important to help them create a connection. We're working to acknowledge issues and pull requests within 24 hours. Even if we're not able to work on those right away, we want to make sure people know that we're active, we're seeing their contribution, and we appreciate it. We also continue to participate in events, and we're actually looking into participating in Google Summer of Code sometime next year. One of the last areas of focus was user interaction. So when people are coming to our repos, what's the experience like? What are the interactions and touch points that they're having? So I already talked about updating tags, and we also went through and updated our issue and pull request templates as well. That not only allows the user to see immediately off the bat the kind of thing we're looking for, it gives them a checklist and in a more consistent way. We also added automated testing to each repo to give us and the contributors more confidence in the platform. We've also been working to remove or archive and consolidate repos that maybe aren't really needed or can be consolidated together in order to reduce the total platform footprint. We've also updated our code of conduct, and that has helped us get to green on GitHub in the community engagement or interaction profile, which we noticed also when they're trying to figure out what repos they want to look at, the community profile is something people definitely take a look at.
And as I mentioned earlier, I joined the team for this summer as a Civic Digital Fellow, which is a really cool program that tries to bring college students interested in mission-driven work into government as a product manager, a designer, a data scientist, or a software engineer. And so as one of the fellows this summer working with the Code.gov team, I got to work on some of the projects that Sara was just talking about. And I specifically worked on a project around defining and tracking our engagement metrics on GitHub. One thing that Sara and I talked about as soon as I joined the team was that it was difficult to track how many issues we had open, how many contributors there had been in the past month, how many issues were stale or that we hadn't responded to, because it was spread out across all of our different repos. And so we had to manually look or collect that information. And so Sara and I talked about how we could create or use some existing tool to track all of those metrics across these various repos. Because we are an open source project and we're promoting open source in the federal government, I first looked to see if there was anything that already existed that did this. But I was unsuccessful in finding any open source project that did what we needed. So I went about the process of creating a new command line interface, which uses the new GraphQL GitHub API to extract these metrics from all of our different repos and put them in one CSV file that we can import into a Google spreadsheet. Like all of our repos, this repo is open source. And so if you want to use this command line tool yourself, it's available on our GSA GitHub organization. And you can feel free to contribute or fork it if you'd like. But it really helps us visualize as a team how many people are contributing, how many issues are stale, all these different metrics that really help us understand if we're improving the contributor experience across our platform as a whole. So here's an example of one of the charts that we've created based on this data that helps us see ways in which we can improve our experience. And there's a few things I want to highlight here that I think really help showcase how important this data is. So one is that every time that we are participating in a hackathon, whether that's something at GW or Hacktoberfest or something else, we see a spike in external contributors, which is that yellow bar in each of the months. And so, in those separate times, we can see that we get a lot more contributions, and that encourages us to keep attending these events because we think it helps grow our contributor community. The second thing is that, as Sara previously mentioned, there was a government shutdown in December, January, and so you can see the impact of that really clearly on this graph. Internal contributors goes basically to zero, and we don't really see a lot of external contributors, which we think has to do with the fact that people didn't want to contribute if they knew their contribution wasn't going to be seen, merged soon. And then finally, we can see that in the last few months, we've actually seen a lot of new first-time contributors, or more than we did in the past. So we want to continue to try and get that green bar to be bigger, have more external first-time contributors, and grow the amount of people that are making Code.gov a great site to host all of these other amazing open source repos.
So for all the work that we have done so far, we wanted to make sure that we were retesting with users and making sure those developers could more easily contribute to our platform, and we weren't just doing all these changes for fun. So to follow up, we're going to be conducting monthly user interviews at a small scale. We've done one of those in September this year already as an experiment, and we're going to continue that in the new year. For these user interviews, we're just going to be testing 3 users on one day, once a month. We'll be immediately debriefing and gathering that information in a one-pager, and then adding those issues to our GitHub repos and to our backlog for action. The idea here is to clear out any major blockers that we can identify with our contributor experience and continue to iterate and make it easier. So what's next for Code.gov? We're going to continue to publish our research and findings on our blog. We already have 2 blog posts up that specifically talk about this same information, and we'll be sharing more in the future. We'll be also taking all the best practices and lessons that we've learned and consolidating those into a federal open source playbook and toolkit to be released early next year. And the goal of that is to encourage other agencies and other projects to follow these same best practices and make sure that the 6,000 repos we have on Code.gov also have a really nice contributor experience so that people are able to add to and contribute to other federal code. And at the end of the day, it's been really hard working on a super important project without a huge engineering team. But I'm so glad that Code.gov is an open source project with a great open source community to help it move forward. As a team, we'll continue to work on small incremental changes every day because that's what public service is about. We work in public service because we get the chance to work hard at work worth doing. So I want to thank those people who have walked along this journey with me along the way, and thank you today. I think we do have a couple minutes for questions if anybody wants to come up and ask a question.
Yeah.
You want to come up? And I'll repeat the question.
So I was wondering, how do you differentiate how you onboard people for code-based repos versus maybe UX or mock-up repos? How do you make that experience work for them? I'm especially interested in how you onboard people for UX and UI contribution work.
So the question is, how do we differentiate the experience between onboarding developers versus other folks who might be doing UX or UI? Okay, so in our 2 rounds of unit testing, they weren't all focused on developers. Our first round of testing was actually, it did include a lot of tasks. It was more asking people questions. What do you do? How do you contribute? What things do you look for? What's important to you? And then the follow-on user research we did was more developer focused. And in the September interviews, again, we had 2 developers and 1 person who wasn't a developer. So we're trying to not just like shoehorn ourselves into the developer experience and get feedback from other folks as well. As far as UX and UI, we haven't specifically focused on that area. Okay.
And to add to that, I just wanted to mention as well that one of the things we thought about when I was creating the tool that I mentioned was that number of issues and number of PRs, all of those are kind of imperfect metrics for determining how many contributions there are to the project, especially since it doesn't track things like UI and UX contributions or people that are helping in other ways. And so I think Code.gov can always use help in those areas as well. And so it's something that I think the team is probably thinking about in terms of how to both encourage contributions from people that aren't strictly developers and how to recognize those contributions in release notes and other ways so that we can make the site better holistically.
Yeah, and I've done a lot of work with students through a local program and folks with no developer experience. So I try to approach our repos with a very beginner mindset from the outside. So if you're really new to code, if you don't even want to code, there are still ways that you can contribute. And actually, a lot of the contributions we got through October and Hacktoberfest were documentation issues where folks could come in and make documentation updates for us. Any other?
Okay, we have a couple other questions.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Georg Link. I'm with Bitergia. Thank you very much for sharing your insights on how to make projects more accessible to contributors. The question is whether you are doing this for the repositories that the GSA is responsible for, or also for all of the contributed code that is contributed to the Code.gov platform from all the other agencies that have to produce open source?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our initial goal was to improve the Code.gov platform itself in all of the repos that we are immediately in charge of. And then to follow that on, we're going to work with federal agencies to improve their repos as well. We wanted to start off with Code.gov so that we were sure we were setting the example that we wanted to see in other federal agencies. So that's going to be the goal of the open source playbook and toolkit for federal agencies that we are working on with other open source maintainers within the federal government that will be launching early next year. Sure.
Hi, I'm Susan from Mindera Softwarecraft. Thank you for being here. I'm curious about your code of conduct, how that came about and what you did to enforce it and how that's going.
So our original code of conduct was in place when I started. But after doing some of our research, we actually moved to a more widely known code of conduct, the contributor covenant, if you're familiar with that. So now we have that on our repos. And it allows people to come in and see right off the bat if they're more familiar with that code of conduct. It builds trust quicker and more easily, instead of having something that was more like government speak that we had created ourselves. We also have internal processes to deal with issues as they can come up. But since I've been on the team in the past year, we haven't had any code of conduct issues reported. Thank you.
Hi. As a maintainer, I feel your pain when the rest of your team disappears and you're trying to fill that void. And the magic of open source is that, in theory, we can have contributors come and replace missing team members or augment our team. Did you find through any of your metrics that the work that you put into making it easier for people to contribute resulted in those contributions being sort of a net positive?
Maybe Courtney can speak about the metrics, but I can speak clearly from my observation from the user interviews that I did in September. We interviewed 3 users, 2 of those were developers, and I asked both of them to pull down the platform and get it running locally on the machine with like no prompting or extra help from me. And they were both able to do that within a couple of minutes. So for us, I feel like that's a big win, because before, when we went to events, we had to have an engineer on site kind of leading people through, here's the platform, here's where you need to go. And now folks are able to actually pull down and get it running locally on their own without us like sitting over their shoulders.
Yeah.
Right.
I was just going to say that's super exciting to hear because Sarah and I spent a ton of time this summer updating
did.
documentation.
We did.
So I'm really glad to hear that that's working. From a metrics perspective, I haven't seen the most recent metrics since I'm no longer on the team, but I think it's hopefully valuable now for the team internally to be able to use those charts to determine if changes are making an impact in terms of the number of first-time contributors and things like that we can use. There's also kind of like SLA metrics for the team, like I was saying, for response time to an issue or a PR, I think was one of the metrics, or how many issues are like more than 120 days old. So it's also kind of a check on the team to make sure that issues are being addressed, PRs are being reviewed, and that hopefully helps create better trust with our existing and future contributors.
And if anyone at all is interested in all the documentation that we created, all the documents, research findings, spreadsheets, you can email us at code@gsa.gov, and we can share that as well.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.